Doing some edge retention testing today with two steels that are kind of opposites from one another. We're looking at 15V with this Spyderco Little Native and 3V with this Kizer Mini Harpoon. So 3V is a high toughness mid-range edge retention steel, and 15V is a very high edge retention kind of mid-range toughness steel, and both of them are non or semi-stainless steels. So I kind of wanted to highlight the differences in what we would see in some regular use with some higher edge retention and lower edge retention. Now the 3V is tougher and it is a little bit thinner behind the edge. I think this comes in around 14 thousandths behind the edge, while the 15V on the Spyderco is a bit thicker, closer to 21 thousandths behind the edge. Now these are relatively close sharpened angles on these as well. The 3V comes in at around 18 degrees, I believe what I got this one to, and the 15V is right around 17 degrees. So only about a degree apart. I know that can play a big difference, but I kind of wanted to also just take that as, you know, the way that these steels can be. You're going to be able to get 3V a little bit thinner with that higher level of toughness. So this is really going to highlight what we're getting out of these different steels. So let's go ahead and do some before sharpness testing. So we'll start with the 3V. So the naming conventions with 3V and 15V. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily exactly the purpose or if it's a series number or something like that, but generally 3V is around 3% vanadium and 15V is around 15% vanadium. So that's where those V's come in with that. So you can see these are both extremely sharp. These were freshly sharpened to around 1000 grit, and they can both shave very easily as well. Effortlessly shave in there. All right, both very sharp. So we'll go ahead and take a couple tests on the best tester so we can get a before use average for sharpness. And we will start with the Little Native in 15V. Now for the Mini Harpoon in 3V. All right, so we've got a before cutting average of 134 on the 15V and a before cutting average of 150 on the 3V. Now that is still pretty close to the same general range of sharpness that we see on the scale of the best sharpness tester. So let's go ahead and cut up the same amount of rope and cardboard. We're going to do 150 cuts through cardboard, 50 cuts through some sizzle rope, and then we'll come back and test again, see how those edges degraded, and see how they performed. All right, so both of these knives really performed great. The thin stock on the 3V really passed through material easily, and pretty much every Spyderco that I've used in this test really performs like a dream. You can tell these are very nicely, purposefully built tools that perform at the task they were created for excellently. So let's go ahead and see how we are cutting after all those cuts through rope and cardboard, starting with the 15V. Now, I'll say also, I tried to keep the cutting towards the heel end of the knife, so the upper inch to inch and a half probably didn't get too much use. I tried to keep it around the flat in the beginning part of the belly for both of these, so we had a consistent area of wear for these tests. So we'll see how we are getting into and through this paper. So we can see when it's getting started easily towards that heel. Let's see if we can start it midway up. It definitely feels like it's cutting rough. It is still cutting, but it's not flying through it as easily as it was before. So we can see a little bit of resistance there. Now let's see the 3V. Just the same. So we can see that it's not as cleanly, but it is still grabbing on and really performing really well for a kind of lower edge retention relative to what we're looking at here, steel. I think with the tougher steels, you know, they have lower wear resistance for you know, that's the real metric, you know, when we're talking about edge retention. They're talking about wear resistance. And those can be two different things, because you can have a really high wear resistant steel, but if it's like really brittle, then you can have like microchipping that could lead to like a lower perceived edge retention. It might chip easier under the same use compared to a higher toughness steel. So in certain applications, you might find a tougher steel holds an edge longer than a higher wear resistant steel because it's not as chippy. Now that's just an extreme example, but that's kind of why I wanted to do these types of tests, just for demonstrative purposes, just to kind of see what we get out of these. Now let's see this 3V. Let's see if it will shave on that portion, and we are not shaving at all with that. How about the 15V? Is the 15V still going to be able to shave after that use? And no, surprisingly not. I thought it would still be able to at least get a couple. So let's go ahead and hit some on the best tester, take some averages, and see how these ended up. We are going to start with the 15V. All right, and now the 3V with the Kizer. All right, so the 3V had an initial average of 150 grams to cut that line, and it had an after average of 187 grams and an increase of only 36. The 15V had an initial sharpness of 134 grams, and that went up on average to 209 for an increase of 75 grams to cut that line. What the f*** is that? Now, why could that be? So let's talk about a few possibilities, and I want everybody to chime in, if you could, to let me know what you think. So the 15V has a slightly shallower angle, so that could be in its benefit. But the 3V is thinner behind the edge, much thinner behind the edge. And that's not known as much for edge retention, but ease of use. It's going to pass through material easier being thinner behind the edge, but a thinner angle, edge angle overall could attest to better edge retention. Now, could this, even though this has been sharpened multiple times, could this 15V have a burnt edge? 15V should have much more edge retention. Final thing, not even the final thing, sorry, could this be where the use, maybe that rope, maybe that sisal rope chopping into that block, maybe there was enough microchipping in this 15V, because it is not as tough of a steel, that it blunted the edge, where we didn't see that as much with the tougher 3V. Maybe that part of the test really wrecked both of these edges, and the tougher one held up better. Now, finally, it could just be that this wasn't enough use for it to be fully conclusive. Perhaps if I brought these to the extremes and just kept going and going and going, hundreds of cuts, we would still see that where they kind of settled in, that the 15V would settle into a much sharper edge than the 3V. Now, I don't know about you, but I use these blades to the point before they could shave and after they couldn't shave, and I'm a sharpening junkie, so I like to keep my knives shave sharp. If you like to keep your knives shave sharp, then you want a knife that's going to stay close to that shaving sharp longer. And it seems like with these, the 3V stayed closer to a shave sharp edge longer than the 15V. I don't know about this one. You know, these weren't single tests. You saw I took multiples and did an average, and the multiples were all relatively in the same range, just within a couple grams of each other. So I tested the same part of the edge that was being used the most to cut the cardboard. I don't know. This one's baffling me. I really want to look further into this one. I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you for watching.